Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na kolejnym panelu, który...
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another panel entitled What Way for Poland? Deeper Integration with the EU or Own Way, Independent Way. My guests are Paweł Kowal, Institute of Political Sciences and Member of Parliament of the Civic Platform, and Zdzisław Krasnodębski, Member of the European Parliament, Law and Justice, Patryk Jaki, Member of Parliament, and Mr. Nowak. There's a political conflict, gentlemen. Some say its source is Poland's looking for its own road. Others say it's the fault of the Polish government. And my question is, what way should Poland go, taking into account the conditionalities currently taken into account, the dominance of the liberal left in such a situation? Is Poland does Poland have no other choice but integrate more deeply with the EU, or should we be looking for an alternative in the Visegrad Group or 3Cs initiatives? How do you see our future? Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I had the pleasure to listen to the last part of the previous panel, yet I don't know what happened during the previous parts of the conference, so I might echo some of the thoughts that have already been formulated. This formulation of the theme, that is deeper integration or looking for own way, well, I don't know about other panelists. I will say that the state of integration as of today is already a threat to sovereignty due to three tendencies that are overlapping. Political tendencies, in a narrow sense, that is the strengthening of centralization and federalist tendencies, the drive for building a European state, like it was recently formulated in the form of a hypothesis. That is the hypothesis of building a European state with the back door or through court rulings. The second tendency is the cultural revolution. The second stage of what happened in 1968, and the economic transformation according to the climate goals. All these tendencies are negative for us, although I don't see integration as such as a negative, but all these tendencies combined, and the aspects of these tendencies might be assessed rather positively, separately maybe. I personally reject such a possibility, and I believe that the policy of being at the table of the previous government. I remember one of the ambassadors in the past telling me that we were one of the big five, and Poland being part of informal meetings, being treated as a big state. But rather that was on the conditions of being accepted to that group, that circle of the stronger states. Now let's move to this independent own way. The editor said, was it deeper integration or independent road in the Union? Recently, an economist, an economist writer, Shalomai, said there is going to be no Polexit, which is the worst solution for the EU. I believe that we have just only started fighting for Europe in a political sense, meaning presenting our vision, trying to build alliances. Sometimes possibly compromising, as we know that in the current landscape of power in the EU, hard work is required to achieve positive changes. These might be slight modifications. Let me enumerate: the Gas Directive revision, which has resulted to be a big problem for Gazprom, or the fund, the Just Transition Fund. But in certain foundational aspects, we should not hesitate and make tough decisions. I must say that the recent ruling of the European Court of Justice and the discussion ongoing won us alliances and at least understanding that it is about a whole construct of the legal system of the Union. At least there's some understanding among the states that are being tried to be taken certain freedoms away. One publicist said that Poland was at the helm of counter-revolution currently. It was a positive light. So this threat to sovereignty is very serious and of a different kind than that from the East, but very serious. And I believe that we should, in Europe, play an active role. And so far, we haven't managed for a number of reasons, but we're ever better at it. We should be building an alliance of conservative and patriotic forces. We should be realistic in assessing our possibilities, because we are no UK, but at the same time we are no periphery. We're no Oceania. We can be rather independent in the European economic area. It also means that we shouldn't give in to empty rhetorics. Journalists say that we might, for example, veto Fit for 55, but in my opinion there is no such possibility. So, independence, self-reliance, yes. Own way, yes, according to the rule for your freedom and for ours. That is, namely, we cannot defend our freedom and our way of life without fighting for freedom of others. That is, we should be defending our status as the state that signs the treaty and is being subjected to a treaty. But we can't do that in isolation, which means we have to build a broad alliance, and we should learn to do what our partners in Poland say. Namely, diplomacy is not meetings and the level of ministers, it's public diplomacy. It's attempts at communicating directly with other societies. We should not make things easier for our enemies, for our opponents, with our rhetorics. So this is not a single leap change, rather it's a change that should be gained with ongoing constant effort. I like to quote Max Weber's: politics is making holes in hard wood, drilling holes in hard wood. That is, it requires an ethos of consequence, consistency. So, politics should not be driven by convictions. Rather, it should be done by paying attention to consequences, but without convictions. Politics cannot be done either to the benefit of the community which the politician serves. That's all on my part. Like I said, it seems to me that we are in a new situation now. It requires of us patience, consistency, and skills, communication skills. I'd add, on top of our weaknesses that make it difficult to act in the international arena, is of course the political divide and the fact that the large part of the Polish opposition is contesting Polish interest. So, a question for the opposition. Professor Krasnodębski just said that the level of integration with the EU is a negative process. Would you agree with that? And the second question, to supplement, which way should Poland be moving? Should Poland look towards Berlin and Paris as the strongest players in the EU, or should Poland be building a coalition around ourselves in the Visegrad Group or the Three Seas initiatives? How do you see foreign policy and our possible path? Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I see three blocks, thematic blocks, that are worth discussing, which I should comment on, I think, although it's going to be difficult because there's a number of issues. First, is typically ad hoc advisory elements, that is, how we assess the foreign policy of the government, European policy of individual political circles in Poland. Well, I'd say that I don't even assess the policy of the government in light of meeting some long-term goal or strategy, because I think there is no strategy, it's tactics. Tactics resulting from internal policy in the country, completely subdued to internal policy, and there's a number of examples to prove that. That's why the Prime Minister agrees to climate goals, carbon goals at COP, but adding on top of that, but in a long perspective, because we are an emerging country, and says something else on a different meeting, and this goes round and round. So I assess this policy very negatively in all aspects of European policy, and I'm able to point to specific sections where this policy is wrong. As to the comment that we contest the Polish interest in the existence of Polish state, I reject such claims. This is why I am here, and I do not agree to this kind of arguments. Let me not tell you what that causes as consequence in the public life in Poland. But I might, if you provoke me. The other issue is more strategic. That is, what should we focus on to have an organized discussion? I think we should focus on two issues. First, sovereignty. I think the discussion on sovereignty in Poland is extremely shallow. There's a widespread lack of understanding of this notion, both historically, that is, how it changed from the 16th, 17th century onwards, how it operates today, and how it relates to achievement and goals of national goals in the European context. Namely, not every integration is contrary to sovereignty, and not every acceleration of integration was against keeping sovereignty. many integrative elements in the history of the EU was helpful of keeping sovereignty of small and medium-sized countries, since sovereignty has become a feature of European countries. The other element, strategically speaking, that's necessary for this discussion to be a serious one, is the issue of roots of European integration. Let me not mention, because we have no time to do that, main key politicians who quite seriously speak at conferences along the lines that going back to the roots of EU is going back to the idea of a community of motherlands. I think that if you are serious about politics, then saying that at the root of European integration is an alliance of motherlands, it's a really terrible mistake, and it makes absolutely no sense. Today's foundation is based on Christian democratic thought who were much more pro-integrative than most politicians who currently operate in politics. And anyone who has graduated from a basic course of European integration must know that, which broke due to French nationalism as a result of the concept of de Gaulle's concepts, leading to strengthening France at the cost of all others. I feel that this discussion should take place in Poland. That is, we should move away from this stereotype along the lines that it all started with an economic integration. There was no talk of politics. That's absurd, and the EU was a very political project, very realistic project from the very start. And it was in the beginning about controlling how much Germany produces of coal and steel, but that was only on the surface. And in fact, it was about controlling the arms race when Germany was developing very fast after the Second World War. We also need to touch upon political issues. That's the third aspect of what I want to talk about. Years since I have started observing what's going on, I am firm in my position that Poles are prone to make unions, Brześć, Lublin, or European unions. And translating that into concrete terms today, I believe that it is in the interest of Poland to strengthen EU institutions, because we are not a big country, we are a medium-sized country geopolitically, or let's say a medium-sized plus with high ambitions, and I think it makes no sense to look differently at the integration than strengthening joint common institutions. And this has been Polish policy for a long time, since I remind you that between 2005 and 2007, when Law and Justice was in power, many conflicts and discussions that we partook in the European Forum as a country saw conflicts where we were involved at the level of European Parliament, but in relation with Barroso's European Commission, we held our traditional line, that is, joint institutions are in the interest of medium-sized countries rather than the big countries. So if we see seriously a threat from the big countries, then we have to strengthen the common institutions, the joint institutions, so that we are less dependent on the big countries. And by these institutions, I mean the European Commission and the Court of Justice of the European Union. And this is a general remark about what I see as real threat to Poland, which I see in the restitution of the Third Russian Empire under Putin. Lack of interest of the USA due to their shift of the point of interest to Asia and the stop to pro-European direction in Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus. A breakdown of Ukraine will break down the whole security policy in our part of the world, and we're going to end up in a completely different geopolitical situation. To make that a more distant scenario, the best instrument is strengthening the European institutions and exerting pressure on those institutions. I, quite frankly, quite seriously speaking, see no other tool to defend our interest. So, a question for member of the European Parliament, Mr. Patryk Jaki. How do you see that? If I understand correctly, Mr. Kowal, his position could be summed up as more EC, more COJ is in the interest of Poland. How do you see that?
When it comes to me, I would like to share my diagnosis with you. I would divide it into two things, into axioms and but before I do it, I will try to stand up to the challenge proposed by our MPs. So the first thing is that the problem may go further west from the Eastern Europe, and a solution can be an alliance with Germany, so the clash of powers. And here I think we will agree on that. It will be a clash between the United States and China. And when seeing a recent political practice, you can see that the U.S. agreed with Germany on Nord Stream 2. So the fact that Germans share its influence in key issue as climate security, which has to do with security in Ukraine. So I think this is quite risky to say that the Germans and that Germany will guarantee that Russia will go away if, when it comes to its strategic policy, they implement its strategic policy when cooperating with Putin. For example, with regard to this energy security and the energy instrument. I fully agree that the total destabilization of Ukraine will cause a great threat for Poland. The second intellectual challenge that I would like to stand to is to formulate, the sentence that you said that the European Union was not conceived as a Europe of states, of motherlands. And what are the evidence backing that? It's all in the treaties, as Professor Nowak said before. A broader integration based on nothing about us without us. That there was supposed to be the right to veto in every mother, and smaller countries couldn't agree for decisions of larger states. If it's not to protect sovereignty of smaller countries, but it's the process of creating federation. So what is that? It's something different to have a stipulation in the European Treaty, and it is the number 3 or 4 that setting out that the European Union respects the sovereignty of member states. It's just an implementation of the European Union as a union of motherlands. So that's all when it comes to these two challenges. But when it comes to diagnosis that I wanted to present, we had yesterday and the day before yesterday and tomorrow we can hear a lot of optimistic voices that Poland is spreading its inspiration, that this ruling of the European Court of Justice caused some debate and inspired some debate, especially in France. With the coming elections then, and possibly the political vectors will be reversed, at least in the European realm. there was this example of governor winning in Virginia. This governor also quoted the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal about the protection of life. But I would like to refer also to this pessimistic part, so I can see some threats for the Polish raison d'être. And I tell it for a purpose. I'd like to stress it. This is a threat for the regime and for the axioms. When it comes to the regime, the sovereignty is key here. How to understand sovereignty? Because if we can see some differences in the definition of sovereignty, I understand it like this, that this is the ability of Poland to take decisions in the most important issues for Poland, that Poland can decide on its own, that Polish people are self-governed. Of course, I understand our limitations stemming from the relevant article of Constitution, that we are a part of international institutions, that we agreed for some limitations, but in some key things, Poland should decide on its own in the most important topics. And I ask this question to many politicians from the opposition. Is there any single area, after everything we can see in the European Union, in which the European Union doesn't have its last word, even with regard to the Polish sovereignty, and they find it really difficult to answer? Why? Because now if we acknowledge the claims of the Commission and the European Court of Justice, for example, with regard to the family law, because they said that, okay, so Poland doesn't agree, so we will have some pan-European family law about adoption and same-sex marriages, despite the fact that it doesn't stop from any treaty. If we mentioned the organization of the judicial system, if we take a look at the issues in which the European Union interferes, for example, the security matters, are they still unanimous decisions, or they are taken by the majority of votes, so without any participation of this Europe of motherlands? So the Commission started a court litigation, and they decided and won that they will decide on its own and they will have the last word. So Poland started to lose the ground behind its feet because it doesn't have the last word in the most important topics. So if there is an attempt to replace the Polish sovereignty, and there are some attempts to take this possibility to take decisions, somebody else has to take these decisions, because we talk a lot about democracy and respect for democracy. And here the EU has another answer, which has nothing to do with democratic solutions. This is a solution that I would say a Judeo or a judgecracy. That would consist in something like that. The judges can undermine every decision of the Polish state by extension of their responsibilities and liabilities, because if we asked the European Court of Justice judges, how do you take decisions if treaty tells that the European Union is not a state, so you can decide only in the areas which were transferred to you and submitted for your decision by Poland. So if we talk about the judicial system, they take this decision and they even penalize us. So if they can do it in this very matter, they can do it in any matter. So this is the problem of sovereignty, the ability of Poland to govern itself. Another problem that I'd like to tackle here, this is with regard to axioms and axiology. With reference to the essay of the Polish spirit, because if we can build the Polish spirit and the strength of it from the Polish values, I will tell you something. When we take a look at the youngest youngest Poles, we will see a series of problems that I would think are the greatest threat, and this threat for the Polish spirit is unprecedented. First and foremost, religion. If you take a look at the level of religiousness among the youth, it has never been so bad with regard to secularization. Second thing, the culture. During these 3 days, we have told a lot. We had the year of Cyprian Kamil Norwid. We had this great spectacle yesterday with recitation of poems, but these were not the most popular events for the youngest populations, for the youngest. But the main event was a concert by a famous rapper with lyrics full of curse and bad words and bad language, so-called pato streaming. And if we add to that some events like best book contest and Polish intellectuals presenting their opinions in a very inappropriate manner and rounds of applause around that. So this gives you the image how the culture looks like now. So that's why I'm afraid of the spirit of Polish people. And in addition, we have some problems with the Polish language. Now, through this common pop culture, the culture of internet, of hashtags, there are some elements coming to the Polish language. Sometimes I think I'm quite young, and I don't feel, I feel like I'm authorized to tell it. Sometimes I do not understand the language used by young Poles because their language is full of anglicisms, of hashtags and abbreviations that it's difficult to understand them. And what happens if that process will proceed and will remain unchanged for the years to come? We will lose our language. And we can see great support among young generations. For example, in response to questions, do you agree for the European Union to have the last word? But that was the sense, that was not the exact quotation. So, and these different emanations of patriotism, so the symbols are violated. I know that I'm running out of time, but what happened in the Polish streets, that the statue of Piłsudski was under attack, and Polish flags were destroyed. It is totally unprecedented. That's why I'm afraid of the Polish spirit and about the cultural war. Of course, human being grows like a tree slowly, but for sure, we should be alerted before it's too late. And hopefully a professor will try to respond to that. But before, I will refer to MP Czerniak in order to present his stance. Further integration in the European Union, or maybe our own path? This is the major question. What is the best path for Poland? What's your opinion on the topic? First and foremost, good afternoon. I think that the questions that were formulated here and they regard our today's panel are quite important, and they're important from the perspective of Poland and of the whole European Union. And the second question about the individual path, I might say that yes, of course, Poland can follow its own path, its individual path. It's the third path and no third path is possible, taking into account the globalism and this big politics and the geopolitical situation of Poland. So today we have to ask ourselves the questions: what do we want from the European Union, without any historical talking about the beginnings? And we should answer the question: what is the real conflict? Is it the conflict between Poland and Brussels, or Poland and European Union? So we ask ourselves the questions about the functioning of European Union and about the mechanisms, or the Western politics is under attack and under criticism. And MP Jaki said that maybe the Polish culture will collapse and the Polish language will stop existing. And we are told that the European Union wants to impose some foreign pattern, some foreign culture on us. But the majority of Poles do not feel that they live that they live under attack. So they do not feel that these patterns are foreign. Let's remind ourselves of 2004. So our main aspiration was to improve our economic situation. But also we liked the values like pluralism, democracy, freedom, because we longed for that when being on the other side of the Berlin Wall. And now this fundamental dispute: what should be the shape of the European Union? Should we follow the integration? Personally, I'm for European integration, of course, in the meaning of unification of some policies, support for institutions resolving some concrete problems. For example, with regard to COVID-19 recently, because I doubt whether Poland, despite their high aspirations and possibilities, would do on its own with all pandemic. The pandemic is global and pan-European, and today this dispute is boiled down to the war of cultures. But this is not the main topic. This is not the essence of the problem today. I think that the government is looking for some excuse in order to escape solving problems that are the most flagrant for Europe and Poland. Now we have problems with the climate change, with energy market, with prices of electricity, roaring inflation in Poland and in Europe as well. These are the main problems that we should tackle now, and we should solve them instead of looking for some other topics that divide society. To quote Churchill, this project of the European Union is not ideal, but we didn't come up with anything better that could replace all this and could cover all these matters. MP Jaki said today that the European Union imposes a system of the judicial system, but I can't remember such a case that the European Court of Justice imposes anything on us. I can't remember of anything, of any attempts to discuss the system on the side of the European Union institutions. Of course, the European Union wants to defend some values which are the foundations of the European Union, and they are inscribed in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union, and the independence of judges is something which should be guaranteed, because court decisions should remain unchallenged, and the judicial system shouldn't, and judicial power shouldn't be dependent on any other power in a state. And to me, this measure of this pluralism, of this democracy, the European Union is the only answer. We cannot take a look at Hungary when the freedom of press is under attack and is in danger. We cannot look for the second Budapest to happen in Warsaw. We need to fulfill our tasks and to follow our visions based on the fact that we're a member state of the European Union, paradoxically, we are too weak now to influence the strategic politics and geopolitics. We're not the player of that size, but we are too powerful in order to adopt any solutions. We should create the solutions with regard to our functioning in the European Union. Poland is a large state which counts on the European scale, and our position is evaluated in different ways now, but after Brexit, we should become the very member state that would impose some concrete solutions. When it comes to V4, the Visegrad group, I'm wondering whether V4 still exists, for example, in the context of Turów mine. Today, our chance is in the European integration and further strengthening of this integration, because as far as I understand, the alternative to the integration to further integration, this is the two-speed Europe. I assume that all of you sitting here together with the members of the government, you do not want to exit the European Union, because all activities indicate that this process may start. James Cameron didn't want the Great Britain to leave the European Union. These were just activities for the purpose of internal politics, and it appeared that it happened. So I don't want Poland to leave the European Union, because today I may say that I'm proud that I'm a Polish person, but I'm also proud I'm an European, and I know this is the chance, an opportunity for Poland and for the youngest generations and for everyone. Because to conclude the myth of third option that we will do on our own within this geopolitical settings between Russia and Germany, that we will cope with that on our own, with our own resources, this way of thinking is faulty. There was a third option in history, and the geopolitics were also complicated. But today, we do not have any other option. I'm under the impression that the critics of the European Union try to present it as a burden for us, not as an opportunity. But let's stress the benefits. In terms of, they tell that we are used as a colony after the markets opened. But this is not a way good of thinking, and it's not the good way to present what happened. The fact that the European Union had such an objective to prevent war and to have a wealthy Europe, they're still very up to date. So let's use this opportunity that we are in the European Union and let's expand our share. We should be a full member of it. We should use the opportunity that we have as the Polish state. Okay, let's put a full stop. So I'm for full integration. Of course, I understand this integration, not in terms of a federal state, because the European Union is not a federal state, it's a hybrid of different systems. This is something between states and intra-governmental organizations. So let's go into the direction of deeper integration. So there is still 15 minutes left during this conference, and I promised some time to Professor Kowal. Patrick Jaki referred to what you've said at the beginning, but he also outlined some point of view, some way of thinking when it comes to European Union and current relationship in the European Union. How do you perceive what Mr. Jaki said? So this understanding of sovereignty presented by Mr. Jaki, it was inscribed in the Versailles Treaty for the Central and Eastern Europe. I can hand over the mic because I came here and knowing that majority of you represent different ideas than me. So such Europe came after the Versailles Treaty, and that was a bad experience. One thing is to declare its sovereignty, the other one is to defend it and to have appropriate tools for that. If you want to integrate in economic terms, and please think about it. If you integrate small and large countries, weak and powerful, so the creators of the coal and steel union were aware of that, and that was known from the very beginning. The integration was not based on manifesto, but on Christian Democrats. Just let's read the archived materials, the talks with Pius the 12th, William Churchill, and his statement in Zurich. This is a far-reaching integration, and that was justified during that time because it was for the purpose of sovereignty for small and large countries, small and weak countries that have no access to markets. Everyone can have the last word, but you have to defend it on the level of access to market and possibility to develop, and in such surroundings, small and large countries do not have the same rights. That requires some political force. But if the court would be enough, that would lead to war. That requires some political authority, as Juncker. He has a flexible backbone. And he said, okay, you have elections, I know that you have to wait. So these are some basic tools of integrations that were already tried in Europe. And I will not start a discussion about the Europe of motherlands. Maybe there is some other version. Maybe you should write some treaty. I know the goal. And it has nothing to do with any serious idea because it's not written. It comes from times later than the integration, and it has nothing to do with Poland. Let me ask another question about one issue you mentioned when it comes to regulation of EU institutions. So it seems that they were projected to self-limit themselves. And in the case of the project we see now, the changes undergone by the European Union, is there any threat? But I don't have much time. Of course, I understand the threats stemming from extensive power of this or that institution, but I know that if institutions were less powerful, Germany would be more powerful. So this madness on the side of Germany would be much greater if it hadn't been for the European Commission. So who could block Nord Stream? If the Commission was more powerful, they would do it. If somebody did anything against Opel, it was the European Court of Justice. We cannot ignore it. We have to take it into account and try to agree. May I? Can I butt in? I reject the discussion about secularization in Poland and telling that the European Union is the only and the first reason behind that. No, it's like Tischner. I couldn't see any Marxist to threat anyone, and I know a lot of examples that priests did it. Let's do not enter that. I highly appreciate church, but I think that pointing our guns at the European Commission and telling that they spoiled our kids, this is a total distortion with regard of what's going on with religion and church in Poland. So when it comes to the culture, if we are to talk about culture seriously, we should organize a separate Congress. I would like to ask you, do you like what happened during last cultural events? And finally, the Polish language. Please stay cool for 1 minute more, okay? And the Polish language. You have several representatives of academia. And if you are experts in that, is there anyone who did more to get rid of the Polish language than the Gowin reform? How can we say that the European Union is against the Polish language? Because his reform got rid of any research carried out in the Polish language. Okay, let's put a comma here. But guys, why are you messing with the European Commission here?
panu profesorowi.
I think it's time to give the microphone to dear professor who has been raising his hand for some time now. Please, gentlemen, my understanding is that a rule of discussion is that we should have equal time, more or less. I talked briefly on purpose because I hoped that a discussion was going to follow. My understanding is that the assumption was different on your part. I wanted to respond to Mr. Kowal. The review of the gas directive was the result of the German-French conflict at that stage. Now, responding to the social democracy member of parliament, I'd like to say that the picture that she painted is externally a very peculiar one. I recently was at a meeting where an ambassador said that he had the same problem with talking about his country, Germany, in Europe, because Germans, part of the German society is skeptical of the EU because it's being idealized, but it's a human creation. You don't know how long it can go on for. Mr. Kowal is right, of course, in terms of integration. The federalist ideas and the foundation of the European integration went further. But many things did not work out, like the defense union. There was the parliament, the commission, with very limited competencies. The parliament was not directly elected, etc., etc. And indeed, it was the case, like René Merwart's book says. Indeed, the European integration of the 50s and 60s saved European nation states. But the process took place. A certain process took place, and that's obvious, and you can't pretend not to see it. And it's accelerated since 2004, since we joined the Union. And that process is spillover. That is, European integration that is a secondary effect, not as a result of federalist ideas, which is very visible at the Conference on the Future of Europe, where it's very difficult to tighten such integration, although it has been done in some respects. But it's being done through COVID, through climate policy, through particular plans, programs of the EU, and this is an approach that poses a threat to sovereignty. And there's room for discussion. The Westphal assumption, the model, is just a model. I'm not as pessimistic as MEP Jaki. Of course, there are decisions to be made that still can be made in Poland, and the process of expanding the remit of the Union as a result of the COJ rulings and based on Article 2, which is very prone to various interpretation. It's also done because who has the right to interpret certain provisions? Well, this right was brought into question by the Polish Constitutional Court. The other question is who has the right to suspend certain rules? Nobody talks about the Maastricht criteria anymore. So we're dealing with certain transfer of competencies in terms of the decision making. One more thing, a bit critical of what MEP Jaki said. I agree that these cultural tendencies are there, but they flow from America to Europe. They are not the creation of the EU. These are tendencies, very radical tendencies, which might not be shared by every member of Western societies. And now referring to what Mr. Kowal said in terms of strategy, indeed, taking into account the situation, internal situation in Poland, and taking into account the realities of parliamentary democracy, indeed, foreign policy and European policy also are rather dependent, rather secondary to internal policy. But I wouldn't say that there is no strategy. And last sentence, the moderator talked about the Visegrad, about 3 Cs. Sure, we should turn towards such initiatives, but we cannot turn our backs on the West. The key area for us is what is going on in the biggest EU states. So we should also be looking at that. This has recently changed. That is, there's a certain shift in France, and we've had some support also on the part of Italy, but also Germany. It's not like Germany is a single bloc. Of course, there are certain national interests and raison d'etat, but alliances are to be found. Maybe such support might be not as strong as in the case of France, as in the case of the ruling of the Constitutional Court. Building our position is also about building our position in the West as well, not only in the region, although these two are not contrary to one another. Thank you very much. Many thanks, Professor, for taking the floor. Last minutes of this panel, Mr. Jaki, MEP. Right, I would like to mention, I wanted to mention scenarios for the future, possible scenarios, but I see we have no time left for that. I am of the opinion that we should seriously start talking in Poland about scenarios that are quite different. Some intellectuals point to the directions the First Republic of Poland followed. My understanding is that there is no space to expand on this strand of discussion. So let me refer to what has been raised. I agree with Professor Krasnodębski and Professor Kowal that cultural problems are not only problems of the EU, although you will agree that the problem exists, and this is something I wanted to stress. This issue comes, on the one hand, from the US, and on the other hand is the result of our internal issues. Among others, the inability of the European Church currently, or the lack of leader. That's something that members of the Church really notice, and that's an issue. But I wanted to show you a certain difference, and this difference is about sovereignty. If we are incapable of reacting to our own issues speedily enough, but keep our capacity to solve these issues is different than what is being created in the EU as institutional solution along the lines you will not get any money if LGBT acts of law are not scrapped, which is a direct continuation of the Polish constitution simply. If not, you will not get any money. And then the conditionality mechanism is yet another step in that direction. This means that with qualified majority you can take away money for all kinds of issues, and particularly cultural issues, because that's how it's formulated. So it's a resolution, so a regulation, sorry, so it is directly applicable. So it's not like in the case of a directive, which means it can be adapted to the Polish conditionalities. So it is already enforced, but the case is in the Court of Justice. If COJ decides that it is indeed binding, then that's nuclear weapons. And then, if I understand correctly the Versailles argument, then its meaning is that the post-Versailles system was too much democracies, and that caused chaos, turmoil. That is, they checked which nationality was where, there was referenda, etc. There had to be some kind of order imposed. Let me just remind you that the problem in Europe, that is the Second World War, resulted from different errors than too much democracy. And this could be expanded on. And it also has its spiritual layer, because that crazy ideology is an issue that we all know too well. And if I understand correctly, then typical of my fourth speaker, with kind words used by my fourth speaker, for whose presence I'm very grateful at this debate, it means that we need somebody who will tame us, because Poles cannot do it on their own, and I fundamentally disagree with that. So, if now we need that tool in the hand of a supervisor for the good of Europe, then I believe that Poland has its strong traditions from the First Republic of Poland, of the Lublin Union, of the cooperation, uniquely democratic cooperation, in how that understanding was built from the Lublin Union to European Union, and referring to how EU was built on respecting one another's system. That's how the Polish and Lithuanian system was built, and this is a legacy of Poland that we have to defend. Thank you very much. We have to finish at this point. Thank you very much. I think this applause is the best summary of this discussion. Many thanks to my panelists, Professor Paweł Kowal, Member of Parliament, Professor Zdzisław Krasnodębski, Patryk Jaki, PhD, and Member Jan Czerniak.